Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our April 16th class session for the EU and US Climate Change Mitigation course. My name is Bruce Murray. I'm the instructor for the course, and today we have a very special guest coming to us from the Midwest in the United States. And his name is Brady Watson, Senior Campaign Coordinator for the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. In his role, Brady supports the program's work in Midwestern states, as well as federal regulatory and state implementation work. He also, and this is especially important for us today, works on implementation of the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. After freelancing in the film and television industry, Brady worked as a civic engineer coordinator for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, where he managed organizing efforts around fuel efficiency standards. Brady earned a bachelor's degree in history from Kansas State University and a master's degree in documentary film and history from Syracuse University. And Brady, having said that, I want to thank you very much for joining us this morning where you are and this afternoon for us. And the floor is yours.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Professor Murray, for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. And oh, cool. We can see people. Hi, everyone. But yeah, I just wanted to clarify. I think you may have had a misspoke there. I'm definitely not an engineer. I'm basically a community organizer. But yeah, let me see if I can share my screen here. And I'm going to attempt to do presenter view, but I'm hoping, do y'all see my notes too? Or can you just see the slides?
We see the slides and we also see your notes.
Oh, okay. Well, shoot. I don't know if I know how to prevent that. Well, I think I may just roll with it, if that's okay, as long as you can see everything all right.
It looks good.
Okay, great. So yeah, as Professor Murray said, my name is Brady Watson, and I'm a senior campaign coordinator with the Union of Concerned Scientists. I actually live in the South in Tennessee, but a lot of my work is focused in the Midwest in the US, and also I do a bit of federal work with the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, which we're going to be talking about today, specifically implementing the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA as it's called, and using that to mitigate climate change. So excited to talk with you all today. But just a little bit about the Union of Concerned Scientists. We are a 501c3 advocacy organization, actually founded in 1969 in Cambridge at MIT. So this was in response to a lot of the nuclear weapons proliferation and escalating Cold War tensions at the time. There were a lot of scientists at MIT concerned about that. And so that's sort of the nexus of UCS. And there's a lot of things happening now. And basically, we put science to use, to work building a healthier planet. And in today's polarized political environment, we're trying to lead with solutions, helping regular people and elected officials find best ways to respond to consequences of climate change in particular, and ramp up renewable energy. And also still, we do a lot of work trying to reduce the threat from nuclear weapons. And we really focus on science and sort of advocating for science-informed policies because we believe that's the best way to enact, meaningful change. Our organization is made up of staff from various backgrounds. We have scientists, engineers, economists, analysts, and organizers like myself, as well as communications professionals. And like I said, I'm not a scientist by training, so won't be able to answer any scientific questions probably today, but we have a lot of really great expert staff. And then in addition to that sort of in-house capacity, we rely on our network of over 500,000 members and supporters, and specifically our 20,000 plus science network members, scientists and experts across the country to try to take action and implement policy to promote positive change around the country. So yeah, today we're going to be talking specifically about the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, which is a big federal program that passed back in 2022. Here's just a little bit about our goal under the IRA. And Professor Murray asked me specifically to talk about the IRA and our work in relations to the Paris Climate Accord and the 2030 goals. So according to the Paris Accord, countries are supposed to halve their emissions by 2030. The IRA is going to bump up our chances of meeting that goal quite a bit, but even with the IRA, with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was a bipartisan bill passed around the same time as the IRA and state policies, that only gets us to about 34% reductions by 2030. So it's going to take more work, and obviously this bill is going to have to be implemented well and even to meet that goal. So with that in mind, like I said, we've still got a lot of work to do, and implementation of this is going to be really key. So that sort of takes us to our work. So as mentioned, the IRA has a lot of money to mitigate and some money for resiliency to climate change. Here in the US, we're seeing a lot of impacts from climate change, including flooding events like you see here, extreme heat, wildfires, and drought across the country. And those, as you likely know, are only going to get worse with climate change. So we've got a lot of work to do to try to mitigate some of those impacts. Just as a snapshot, there is, especially in the past few years with COVID and some spending bills that were passed, there's a lot of funding for clean energy programs and justice-focused programs. These are just a couple of them in addition to the IRA, which you see there on the sort of the third one from the right. There's a couple other bills that were passed, including the IIJA, which I mentioned, and the CHIPS bill, which is a sort of a scientific investment bill there. But it's a lot of money. And by comparison, the New Deal in the 30s under FDR was about 11 billion in infrastructure spending. And under President Obama in the 2000s, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was about 90 billion. So comparison to that, the IRA is quite a bit bigger. This is just another way to look at it. You can see how much bigger it is than annual appropriations bills, which is just sort of regular spending in the U.S. from 2007 to date. You see the Recovery Act there in the middle, and then on the right, just the massive amount of spending with the IRA. This is sort of the buckets of money under the IRA. As you can see here, the biggest bucket is for clean energy programs, 177 billion. There's also a fair amount for clean fuels and clean vehicles, electric vehicles, things like that. There's also money for clean energy manufacturing, and then individual residential clean energy incentives like home rebates and incentives. And you can see a few other buckets there with some climate, some air pollution mitigation, forestry, things like that. So basically, at UCS, we see our role as attempting to improve access to funding, especially for frontline community groups under Justice 40, which basically is a mandate from the Biden administration here in the US that 40% of federal funding go towards disadvantaged communities. And so the IRA is subject to that. 40% of the spending is meant to be for the disadvantaged communities. We also want to add our scientific capacity with existing networks. So right now we're working with a group called the Environmental Protection Network, EPN, which is made up of a lot of former EPA staffers and other experts around the country. We're also working with something called the REAMP Network, which is basically a coalition of organizations in the Midwest working to mitigate climate change and advance more equitable clean energy policies in the Midwest. And then we also have former EPA staffers and folks that have worked with government entities, including the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, the Department of Energy, that's DOE, NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and then FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And then a lot of the implementation of the IRA is actually going to come down on the state level. So the money has sort of been allocated through the bill at the federal level, and then that money flows to the state level, who then administer the grants and the credits to local communities. So a lot of the implementation is actually going to be on the state level, and that's sort of where we come in. Community change grants. So this is a program that the EPA is administering. That's one of the areas of focus for us. It's a $2 billion program that's currently open and accepting applicants through November 2024. It's supposed to fund roughly 100, a little bit more than 100 community projects at $10 to $20 million per project. And some of the things that those grants can cover include things like climate resiliency and adaptation, mitigating climate and health risks from things like urban heat islands, extreme heat, wood heater emissions, and wildfire events. Include investments in low and zero emission and resilient technologies and infrastructure, and then also workforce development that helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other air pollutants. So yeah, there's a bit, basically the community change grants are a competitive grant program. So community groups will submit applications to EPA. And then there's sort of a rolling application deadline through November of this year. And groups will be awarded based on their ability to sort of meet the criteria of those applications. And then the next sort of item we're working on is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is another big program under the Inflation Reduction Act that's being administered by the Environmental Protection Agency. This one, we're focused particularly on the Solar for All provision, which is $7 billion, and actually is all of that money is allocated for low-income solar. So it's meant to really expand access to solar for low-income communities, especially folks who may not own their home or be able to install rooftop solar. And so this is meant to, again, expand access, things like community solar, things like microgrids, things of that nature. We're expecting that award anytime. Actually, it's been sort of pushed around several weeks already, and we've heard sometime in April. So hopefully we'll hear that about any time. And the EPA has until September of this year to actually allocate that funding. And our work around the Solar for All basically includes working with our state coalition partners to kind of influence and track applications. We submitted letters of support for Illinois, Maine, and Massachusetts at the state level, and then have been tracking those applications sort of ever since. We're really trying to influence the program planning at the state level and help hopefully best meet the needs of disadvantaged communities. So we're meeting with some of these state energy offices that will be applying for and sort of implementing these programs and trying to make sure they are using best practices to do the outreach to the communities and actually plan the Solar for All programs with communities and make sure that they're actually meeting those communities' needs. And this last note here, I think in the whole Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, at least 60% of those funds have to be allocated to Justice 40 communities. But Solar for all of that money is actually for low-income solar. And I believe I think has to result in at least 20% savings on folks' utility bills. So it actually has to result in savings, and it has to go to those low-income communities. Additionally, we are working with a group called Green Latinos here in the US, which, as the name implies, works with Latinx groups around the country to try to assess needs of those communities that they see as far as solar access, and then try to help those groups understand the application process and actually get those funds when they are awarded, hopefully here soon. Another aspect of the IRA that we're working on are they're called low-income and energy communities bonus tax credits. So there's sort of two big pots of money. There's tax credits and then there's rebates and grants. And the tax credits are a big part of it. The energy communities bonus is essentially 10% on top of existing investment and production tax credits. And energy community is basically defined as a place that's impacted by refinery or coal mine or power plant closures. So obviously, as we transition to renewable energy, we're going to see a lot of impacted communities when the fossil fuel plants, which have been really big economic drivers for those communities, when those inevitably close down and transition. So this is meant to sort of incentivize investments in those communities to help them transition to clean energy. Low-income and tribal communities bonus tax credits is also a 10% bonus on top of the existing investment tax credit. And that's for any solar, wind, or storage project installed in low-income communities or on tribal lands. And then there's an additional 20% bonus for any of those facilities that are part of low-income residential housing. So say it's on a public housing location in a community, or delivers at least 50% of power to low-income households. And these are sort of a rolling application too. They're open now and they're available through 2025. And they're sort of being administered by the Department of Energy. In our work around this particular tax credit, again, this is going to be implemented largely at the state level. So we do a fair amount of regulatory work with public service commissions or public utility commissions in states, which basically oversee utility planning. And we're gonna try to make sure that utilities are adequately planning for these tax credits and using them to help drive more clean energy investments in these communities. Another one we're working on is called the Thriving Communities Grant Making Program, and this is essentially so this money is allocated from the federal government to 11 grant makers who will then distribute that money to community groups and organizations. And this includes $550 million in quote unquote small grants. We're currently partnering with REAMP, which is again the network in the Midwest to target rural communities. So they've been awarded one of the grant making awards, and they're focusing specifically on rural communities. So as y'all I'm sure know, rural it's a pretty broad definition, and rural could mean a lot of things. And what we're really trying to do is help them target that outreach to communities who are most in need. And our data team is working to sort of apply a mapping tool through something called the Climate and Energy Justice Screening Tool, which EPA put together, which basically looks at a number of factors like communities that are close to fossil fuel infrastructure, communities that have been historically underinvested in, and then we also layered that with our Too Hot to Work data, which basically looks at outdoor workers that are exposed to extreme heat, basically, outdoor workers in the summer that are working on things like farms, construction, and sort of layering those two things together to see where our communities may be outsizedly impacted by, fossil fuel pollution, other environmental justice issues, and where there are a lot of workers working outdoors who are impacted by these extreme weather events, just as an attempt to try to narrow that outreach to rural areas. And then there's one of the grant makers that we supported is called the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. And they were awarded one of the grants as well. So they'll be distributing those funds to groups in the South, which is where I live. Another big pot of money is from the EPA. It's called the Climate Pollution Reduction Grants. And it includes $5 billion in new funding specifically to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other air pollution. As you can see here, there's a little bit of money for planning, but a lot of it, the vast majority, is actually for implementation. So $4.75 billion available through 2026. And basically, states, territories, municipalities, air pollution control agencies, tribes, and groups covered under a plan under this program can apply. And so far, we have sort of worked to provide comments on the applicant's priority climate action plan. Basically, those are put together by states and municipalities to try to outline what they plan to do to reduce emissions. So it's specific things and actions that they plan to take and how they plan to take them to result in those greenhouse gas reductions. Those were actually submitted just last month from states all over the country. I want to say 45 of our 50 states submitted climate action plans. And we submitted comments specifically on the plans in Massachusetts, Illinois, Maine, and Michigan. And so as this process goes along, we'll continue to follow that implementation process and engage in stakeholder engagement as needed. And then after this initial priority climate action plan, which is sort of like a shorter version, The applicants will also have to submit a comprehensive climate action plan in 2025, which is basically a more comprehensive, broader, more detailed version of the priority climate action plan. And that will be a really good opportunity to see, sort of how serious these entities are about reducing emissions, but also doing so equitably and making sure that frontline communities are involved and benefiting from these measures. Another one we're working on, this is a bit of a different one, sort of a different approach. I'm sure you all are at least vaguely familiar with the carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS. This is an existing tax credit that was actually expanded under the IRA. And we're seeing a lot of concern from community groups, especially frontline and environmental justice communities. We are working sort of in a defensive posture on this, working with coalitions, because a lot of frontline groups see this as very risky, because they basically worry about perpetuating the use of existing fossil plants, because essentially carbon capture would be applied to existing plants to capture the emissions, but there are a lot of concerns that while the carbon could be captured, there are other emissions like NOx, other air pollution that might not be captured, and then also sequestering carbon and the pipelines traditionally used to transfer the carbon are also folks are concerned about that as well. So basically, we're going to be tracking the CCS proposals of the power sector in some of our states we work in, through Public Utility Commission proceedings, through state public service commissions, as well as the EPA is currently finalizing what's called Section 111 rules of the Clean Air Act, which are basically set to reduce emissions of the power sector. And there's a lot that goes into this, but essentially a Supreme Court decision last year, West Virginia versus EPA, limits what the EPA can sort of tell power plants to do. They can't direct them what sorts of generation to use, but they can direct them to reduce emissions. And so basically, one of the few measures available to power plants is CCS if they don't install renewable energy, which obviously is the hope. But how this rule is implemented and how it's finalized is going to have a big impact on the CCS tax credit as well. So we'll be following that. And then one specific project we're tracking is the Net Power CCS project. And I forget exactly where that is, but basically, like I said, we're sort of just taking this as a tracking opportunity to sort of make sure that it's not used to perpetuate the continued use of fossil fuel infrastructure, essentially. Another one we're working on is it's 45B, which is the clean hydrogen tax credit. This was a new one established under the Inflation Reduction Act, and essentially incentivizes the production of clean hydrogen. Now, the big sort of million-dollar question is how clean is going to be defined and what sorts of projects this credit actually applies to. And this is something, they're essentially a varied amount of hydrogen that is currently exists, and it's sort of categorized by colors. And so there's green hydrogen, there's blue hydrogen, there's gray hydrogen, there's pink. Essentially, it has to do with how the hydrogen is produced. Green hydrogen is something that produces hydrogen from renewable energy through a process called electrolysis, and basically that's what we hope to see the Department of Treasury actually implement as the types of projects that can be included. But there's a ton of pressure from industry to include things like gray hydrogen, which can be produced from fossil fuels with carbon capture. Pink hydrogen is, I believe, from nuclear facilities, and then blue, I forget what blue is, but basically there's a bunch of ways to produce hydrogen, and we're really hoping to make sure that only truly green and clean hydrogen is applicable under this tax credit. Specifically, there are sort of three pillars that a lot of groups are hoping to see maintained in the existing in the tax credit when it's finalized. And those three pillars are hourly matching, additionality, and deliverability. And essentially that means that hourly matching means that if a facility is using renewable energy to produce the hydrogen, then that energy actually has to be produced during the time the hydrogen production process is happening. So it's sort of like a one-to-one match. Additionality means that the renewable energy being used to produce the hydrogen is new energy on the grid. It's not taking energy, say, that's going to power people's homes to produce hydrogen. So it's got to be additional renewable energy on the grid. And deliverability just means that the renewable energy meant to produce hydrogen can actually be delivered to the site where it's being produced, and actually, power that process. So that's sort of the hydrogen tax credit that we're paying attention to as well. And I can actually share a couple blogs about that here in a bit. But so yeah, I want to also just mention that like I said, we're a science-led organization. We have a big science network that we try to sort of mobilize and get to take action. And that includes people like you. It can be, students, grad students, faculty that want to take action for climate change or other issues that are facing us. So just want to make a plug for the Science Network. I can drop the link in the chat here, but it's not it's not just another email listserv. We do send some emails, but it's typically not more than 3 a week. And we try to target our emails towards your interests, expertise, and where you live, like the congressional district. And will contain opportunities like trainings, webinars, and in-person events near you. So essentially, the science part of the Science Network advocates for rigorous independent analysis, while the network offers avenues for connection and collaboration between scientists and policymakers and community members around the country. There are a number of actions that we ask our Science Network members to take, including with like partnering with community groups to provide scientific expertise on local issues, education efforts to try to educate legislators and other decision makers on the science behind policies and issues, serving as a resource on federal, state, and local advisory boards. There's a lot of public comment opportunities for some of the tax credit guidance and the other implementation of the IRA. So that could be another opportunity for experts to sort of leverage their expertise. And overall, just sort of trying to help shift the culture in the scientific community, because I think in some cases, scientists may not be comfortable sort of advocating for positions outside of their sort of 9-to-5 jobs. But obviously, as scientists, y'all have, and scientists do have a very important part to play in policy implementation here in the US. So we just hope to encourage scientists to sort of step out of the lab and into the streets, as this sort of image displays. And yeah, this is the last slide, but here's my email. I can also pop this in the chat, but thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I can open it up to questions now.
Brady, thank you very much. I may not have mentioned that we're here in Vienna, Austria, and you said generally where you are, but could you say where you are specifically?
Sure, yeah. So I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, which is in the US South. And then it's kind of an interesting setup. I work remotely, and my sort of home office is in Chicago. So that's why a lot of my work is focused on the Midwest. So yeah, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin are sort of our main states in that region.
Thank you very much for your strong presentation with a wealth of information, and also for sticking to the time limit so that we have really some good time now for questions and answers. And I have so many I want to ask to get the ball rolling too. I'm going to ask number one. And we, in this course, are laser focused on 2030 with Paris Agreement, IPCC people saying we have a really big goal to achieve by 2030. And we are very, very hopeful and engaged in figuring out how Inflation Reduction Act implementation can help us get there, also with the US government saying it can do that. And from your standpoint, during now this first year plus of going from passing the legislation to implementing it, what do you see as working best? And what do you see that from your standpoint needs improvement? And I'm especially in that context interested in the collaboration between the federal government and the states, because I think we're learning that that is really crucial.
Yeah, definitely. And that's sort of the crux of it. And folks in Austria may not be as familiar with sort of our political environment here, but oftentimes there is a bit of a there's a bit of a contentious relationship between some states and the federal government. We have some Republican-led states, we have some Democratic-led states, and sometimes, not always, but you've got some Republican-led states are less keen on renewable energy and making this transition, whereas a lot of the Democratic states are more so. And so it's part of the struggle is making sure that those red states are actually, taking the time to apply for these credits and these grants and trying to get the money to flow to their states. And so that's definitely a challenge at times. The other challenge, obviously, with the IRA is it's a lot of incentives, but it doesn't necessarily force anyone to do anything. It doesn't. You can't like make people buy solar panels or like buy electric vehicles. So a lot of what we need to do, and sort of what I see our role as an expert-led organization, is actually advocating for personal changes, right? Like just making people more open to things like renewable energy. The adoption of electric vehicles. Our largest greenhouse gas emitting sector is transportation, and so it's not like you can make people buy electric vehicles, right? So I think that's one thing that we've got to work on is education and just making people more comfortable with the technologies that are new for many people. I think the one thing that is sort of working is I think a lot of the tax credits, because a lot of those are driven by developers. And so, of course, they want to get, sort of the cheapest product they can. And if they can take advantage of tax credits to build solar, like a lot of solar developers are taking advantage of those tax credits already. And so those are sort of market driven, they're sort of working. The other thing, like a lot of these programs just haven't been implemented yet, right? So the money is out there, but it hasn't actually flowed to communities. And so just actually sort of like preparing and doing the groundwork to get the money out the door is a big thing we're working on too. And so yeah, those are, I guess, a couple of things I would say. I think the other sort of issue we're seeing, and that's again where we're hoping to sort of tap into our science network, is a lot of these communities who sort of most stand to benefit and have the most need also have the least amount of technical expertise and knowledge and capacity to do these applications, because a lot of these applications for these grants are technical. They're long. They can be hundreds, dozens or hundreds of pages long, and a lot of communities just simply don't have the capacity to do that. And so there is some technical assistance from the EPA and other government entities, and there's a lot of nonprofits doing this work. But at the end of the day, I think there's a gap to fill between the technical assistance abilities of these community groups and actually the need to meet those technical assistance needs. So yeah, those are a couple of things I would add there.
Thank you very much for those comments. I remember being in the United States last summer and talking to retailers, people selling heat pumps, people selling photovoltaic panels, and asking them if they were starting to integrate IRA provisions into their marketing. And it seemed as though it was getting started, but it needs to be accelerated quite a bit. So I agree with you quite a bit on that measure. And we're going to move the camera now back to the classroom and take questions from students. Many of them have even submitted questions to me, thinking about asking them today. Who would like to start from the student group with a question about Inflation Reduction Act implementation?
So you mentioned the Supreme Court's West Virginia versus EPA court ruling. Can you talk a little bit more about how that actually affected transitioning to clean technologies, and how the IRA actually has that managed to kind of reverse this ruling, or how has that helped fix the situation since then, basically?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think frankly, a lot of it sort of remains to be seen. It's a pretty new decision. And I think that's sort of the difference between regulation and sort of incentives. A lot of the IRA is just incentivizing behavior, right? And that Supreme Court decision, basically, like I said, it limited the enforcement capabilities of EPA, so they can't come in and like tell a utility or a power plant that they have to shut down and they have to install renewable energy. All they can do is, it basically applies to technology that can be implemented at the plant itself. So basically things like CCS, which can reduce emissions, but they can't be like, you must build a solar farm here. They can't do that. And so it definitely, it's going to have an impact. A lot of this stuff is actually like the Clean Air 111 rules are going through. They're probably going to be challenged legally too, you know, while the EPA finalizes these, because there's just a lot of vested interest, obviously, in fossil fuels, and the status quo is fossil fuels. And so that industry is not going to go down without a fight. And then there are a lot of states who are, you know, less keen to renewable energy too. Like I said, it's probably about half the states in the US are less inclined to go to renewable energy, let's say. But the good thing is the IRA is making it economically much more feasible to do, right? Like it sort of levels the playing field. And even without it, we're seeing like the cost of solar panels has come down exponentially. And right now, solar is the cheapest form of energy you can get in the US. It's even cheaper than natural gas, which is currently our largest source of power in the United States. And so yeah, it's challenging. It's made it harder, but I think there are a lot of obviously the IRA has a lot of good incentives to sort of incentivize. It's sort of I guess I would say it's a carrot versus stick sort of approach, whereas the stick is like a regulation, the carrot is more of an incentive, and that's what the IRA is, just a lot of incentives. But yeah, we'll see how it plays out, and obviously, you know, the next 6 years are going to be crucial for 2030, so we're going to have to sort of see how it plays out. But yeah, it's a great question.
It also is one that reminds us of the Biden-Harris administration whole of government and whole of society approach. That means it wants to use executive, legislative, and judicial measures. EPA is in the executive branch, and it is true that there have been legal cases challenging the executive branch's authority to regulate behavior. And at the same time, you can say, oh, shucks, what are we going to do? And in states like Illinois, which has been mentioned a few times, it can be that legislatively, also at the state level, there is some provision to ensure, for example, that coal plants will be shut down by a year. And that is a part of the Clean and Equitable Jobs Act in the state of Illinois. Oh, it's so tempting to ask more questions. However, please let's continue with students asking questions. Remember the questions you sent in for today, and who would like to ask the next question? All right, I'm going to ask again in another minute. I want to continue. You focused a lot on lower income and also Justice 40 spending. And my understanding is that a great deal of that spending requires that, in a sense, communities or individuals, it can also be things like churches, that they spend the money up front to buy, say, a PV installation for their roofs, and then they submit paperwork for that to get a reimbursement. One of the challenges is that there are lots of communities out there, lots of entities that would like to do that, but they don't have the money to spend up front. And how is the Inflation Reduction Act, maybe with organizations like the Union for Concerned Scientists trying to fix that, making sure that there is the opportunity for groups to be able to spend the money up front so that they can get the reimbursement.
Yeah, another good question. So yeah, that's really the crux of the issues, right? Like tax credits require you to have taxable income, and a lot of the lowest income communities who may need this the most don't even have income to tax, or they can't afford that upfront investment of the technology. Or a lot of the folks are renters too, so they don't actually own the buildings in which they live. And so it's hard for them to actually access and like put a solar panel on their building. So I think that's where like Solar for All comes in, because it's really focused on things like community solar, which means there's a sort of a centralized solar facility that may not be directly on your building, but it's tapped into that community, and then each community member benefits from it. And so that can sort of enable communities who may not have, like you said, the funding to purchase a solar panel to put on their roof, or maybe don't even have a roof, or don't have the income or the tax, to apply for the tax credit. And that's really why we're focused on it, because there is a gap, right? So like solar historically has really been only for wealthy folks that can afford it on their roofs. And so Solar for All and that $7 billion is really focused on sort of expanding access and making sure that communities who, up to this point haven't been able to afford it will be able to. And another thing we're really pushing for is community-owned community solar. So historically in the US, a lot of community solar has been sort of utility owned, and that means they sort of control it. It may not actually, all the benefits may not flow to the community members themselves. And so community ownership actually ensures that the community is benefiting the most from that solar. And there's also a lot of different government structures and sort of how the community solar is administered. But a lot of sort of the best models we're seeing are cooperative models. So the group sort of comes together to decide the decision-making, the democratic decision-making process of the community solar. And that's sort of what we're hoping to see the most, is those sort of the community-owned and democratically sort of governed community solar projects. And that's sort of where the community change grants can come in too. Like those can fund things like community solar projects, microgrids, which allow folks in communities who may not otherwise be able to afford solar to take advantage of those technologies. So yeah, that's a great question.
All right, back to the students. Who would like to ask the next question? First, Herr Harbein.
I just wanted to hear another explanation about the difference between matching additionally and deliverability. Hydrogen tax credit, I missed it a little bit. The differences between the three pillars of the green hydrogen pillars.
Sorry, I couldn't, I had three pillars, but I can't quite hear the question.
I just want to hear the difference between the matching additionally and deliverability on three pillars. I just wanted to hear that again so I could get it typed down.
Yeah, sure. And let me actually, while we're talking, I'm going to just share the blog, because frankly, my colleague is way better at explaining this than I am. But so yeah, essentially, so hourly matching means that while the hydrogen is being produced, the renewable energy powering that plant is also being produced at the same time. So basically it's a 1-for-1. You have to be producing the energy to make the hydrogen at the same time you're making the hydrogen. Additionality just means that you can't take existing renewable energy and then divert it to make hydrogen. You have to add additional renewable energy to the grid to power that hydrogen production. So yeah, additional energy. And then the deliverability just means that the energy that's being produced with the intent of producing hydrogen actually has to make it to the plant that's producing the hydrogen. So you can't just like add renewable energy, say it's going to hydrogen, and then it actually not be delivered to that plant. If that makes sense.
An analogy might be that I could say, I'm buying an e-vehicle, and then someone would criticize me saying, well, where's the electricity for that e-vehicle coming from? Is it coming from fracking natural gas or coal plant or whatever. And I think these provisions are designed to make sure that you don't use fossil fuel energy to create hydrogen energy.
Exactly. And just a bit more on hydrogen is sort of it's a bit controversial because like the best methods are to power our society are really just renewable energy directly. And so there are a lot of concerns because we don't want to see that renewable energy diverted to make hydrogen. And so it's sort of one of those things where we hope to see it used in sort of a limited capacity. Like there are some hard to decarbonize sectors like industry, for example, like steel production that really do require a lot of energy, and something like hydrogen could work well for. But you know, there are a lot of concerns about just seeing this widespread production of hydrogen because it could introduce there's a lot of potential loopholes, right? In a lot of ways that could actually increase emissions if it's not implemented correctly. So it's sort of it's a tricky subject that we're following pretty closely.
And yeah, Combine, your presentation earlier fits in here. We want hydrogen not to be carbon neutral, either net zero or climate positive. Okay, another question.
Yes, so in our class, we've talked a lot about policies and different incentives to mitigate climate change. But we've also talked about how implementation is where we struggle quite a bit. And so I was wondering, with all of these funds and grants and tax credits that you've mentioned, what is actually the time frame if someone applies for this? How long does it usually take to actually receive these grants and then to be able to implement these technologies? Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. That's the question. And like I said, a lot of these they're not ready yet, right? So like a lot of this money is sort of just sitting there because the programs are still being designed. The tax credits, that's a great question. I'm not sure. Those are the one things that sort of are up and running for the most part. Like a lot of the other grants, like community change grants, the Thriving Communities, Solar for All are actually not implemented yet. So sort of remains to be seen. But a lot of them do have deadlines. So like Solar for All, that money has to be out the door by September. And so we'll know we'll know pretty soon. But yeah, that's sort of one of the issues. And the other big sort of elephant in the room is that we have an election this year. And if things, you know, go one way, a lot of this funding could disappear, right? If it's not out the door. So obviously that's something we don't want to see. We'd hate to see that money sort of taken off the table, but it is a possibility. You know, if we have another administration and the money hasn't been distributed yet, it could be, you know, it could be pulled back and it could never get out the door. And so I think there is a lot of pressure on the administration and the, you know, EPA, DOE to actually get the money out because one, it's needed, right? Like we have a pretty short time frame to meet our carbon goals, and also it's possible that the administration could change and all this money goes out the window. So yeah, there's a lot of pressure for sure.
And in that context, thinking about the 50 states, remember there is the close to $380 billion, which has been set aside, allocated for spending. And much of that money is going to the states for those states then to decide how to use it. And we heard some state names. Illinois was in there, Massachusetts, I think Maine was mentioned. And thinking about what Brady Watson just said, you can recall that there are 22 states where there are governments with one party in control of 3 branches. And it just makes sense that in those cases, those governments are going to be able to spend the money quicker. And it's just logical to be looking at states like the great state of Illinois for that purpose. And then in the super election year, by the way, it's the same in Austria, the European Union, and elsewhere, to think about which candidates are going to be the ones who will be willing to work hard to continue the implementation process and to make it work more effectively. As Brady Watson has just said, we're not quite there yet. I have a final question. would you be willing to entertain further questions for us if we bundled them and sent them to you via email?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to.
All right, then we are going to take that into consideration, and we are going to ask you a final question, and that is, if you looked out that window to your left, I think it is, does it look
Mhm.
like a nice spring day where you are?
It's supposed to be pretty warm. Yeah, I think about 80 degrees Fahrenheit here. It's a bit cloudy right now, but yeah, overall pretty nice.
We're going to take a short break now, and then we're going to move on to the state of Illinois to
Oh, great.
talk about our collaboration in a group of about 56 students trying to continue this discussion about how to implement well, implement quickly with that 2030 deadline in mind.
That's great. Well,
Thank
good
you very
luck.
much, Brady.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. End the meeting.
I think
Oh, yeah, we
can
won't record the
just
next
end
one.
the record.